Thank you. Can you assure this audience that Ukrainians will be at the table and Europeans will be at the table?
Oh, well, you just changed the whole dynamic. Victor, thanks for having us today. I appreciate it. The answer to that last question, just as you framed it, the answer is no. The answer to the earlier part of that question is yes. Of course the Ukrainians are going to be at the table. I mean, it would be foolish to say they wouldn't. But when you say at the table, you have to define it. One of the things I'm driving towards is we've had a good – remember, this war has been going on now. We're heading into the third year. One of the things we haven't really gotten to are specifics.
So the Europeans who have provided as much or more support than the Americans in this process, you don't think should be at the table directly. You think it should be two protagonists.
I said I'm a school of realism. I think that's not going to happen. But I said that's one of the reasons I'm here talking to people. One of the reasons we're going out, we're doing it, to making sure that their positions are well known, that when we go into these positions, they're well stated. Now, that may be graded like fingers on a chalkboard. That may grade a little bit, but I'm telling you something that's really quite honest. So if you part of the problem that we looked at when you looked at Minsk too, there was a lot of people at the table that really had no ability to execute some type of peace process, and it failed miserably. So we're not going to go down that path.
I see. Thank you. That's.
But our philosophy is not to continue this war to the death of every last Ukrainian. The intent is to stop the carnage, stop the war, make sure it's reasonable, making sure the sovereignty stays intact. But we're going to get to specifics about it. When you say sitting at the table, in all probability, there's really going to be one of the reasons I'm here is for the input, obviously. But when you sit at the table, there's two protagonists when you look at it, and there's one hopefully to be an intermediary. When you look at
who are the protagonists and who's the intermediary?
Well, I'm saying is it depends. Notice I'm being very diplomatic about it. I got my diplomatic hat, my passport in my pocket. The fact is, we're looking at, you can have the Ukrainians, the Russians, and clearly the Americans at the table talking, but we've got to have specifics to get to a point. But I'm driving towards very, very specifics, very, very hard data that we can say this is what it looks like. And then it's going to be up to the two belligerents that are fighting each other right now, the Ukrainians and the Russians. Is this acceptable? But there's no way, nobody would ever exclude, and nobody's even said that. I would challenge anybody in this room or anybody in the audience to say, when have we ever said that the Ukrainians would be excluded from any discussion? It's never been said. You know, President Trump's been very open about that. Respond. Do you respond by saying, that happens?
It was 15th of February. President Trump has been less than 30 days into his job as the President of the United States. Right? And we've accomplished more in the last 30 days than the last administration did in almost now 3 years of war. You know, and I've been very critical publicly about when the comment was made, well, as long as it takes as much as it takes to end this war. President Trump looks at it a lot differently. And President Trump looks at it a little bit like I do. When you're talking about the war, it's in a human dimension. You know, we can talk about the weapons of the war that you use and the economics of it. And he looks at it like in a humanistic way. Let me just simply put, looking at our friends there from Ukraine as well. You know, the losses of the Ukrainian side, they match up, they exceed by triple the amount of soldiers that the Americans lost in both the Vietnam War and the Korean War combined. I mean, this is World War II level of violence. And when we look at the city of Mariupol, a city that has been destroyed, think of the American city of Detroit. Sorry, not Detroit, but the city of Denver, totally destroyed. That's the levels of the violence and the level of destruction. And President Trump is saying, we've got to bring that down. There's got to be a way to have a just and lasting peace. And I think what you're starting to see, I think, in this conference is a great example of it, where you're starting to allow people to realize after coming on the 24th of February, we're finally starting to say, okay, we need to bring this war to an end, figure out how it's going to end. But we also need to understand we need to ensure Ukrainian sovereignty. We need to ensure that they are protected in that light. And so the question you have to ask yourself, well, how do you get there? Part of this process of this conference was to talk to the European alliance. We're going to be critical to this. Because when you hear you've got to bring the allies with you as well. And how do they play? Are they going to play a part? Of course they are. But if you've got to bring for a lasting peace, you can't do this on your own. You can't do it to the exclusion of President Zelensky in Ukrainians. You can't do it at the exclusion of anyone. They all have to be involved. And that's part of my process. That's part of the process that you're seeing as well, which is happening here. We're talking about the allies. You know, and you also look at what's happening, what we're going on. So when you think of a dual track, for those of you that are not following it, you see that right now we've got actually a dual track going. And that's important to realize. What I mean by a dual track, you've got a Russian track going on, at the same time you've got a Ukrainian track going on. So if you look at the news, you see that you've got an envoy for the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, is involved, because he's got the Russian lane, and I'm working the American/Ukrainian allied lane as well. And we're doing that for speed, because what we want to do is say, well, when is this thing going to end? You know, are we going to come back in a year in the Munich conference in 2026 and say, you know, we're going to study this for another year, and we're going to think about it. No, we're talking time, and I need to do that work with Donald J. Trump. You need to understand, I'm on Trump time. And Trump time means he asks you to do this job today, and they want to know tomorrow, why isn't it solved? So we're working from a timeline, we're saying, that I use the time publicly of 100 days and back to make sure that the parties are involved. We get to a degree of separation. We get to a degree, and this is not confirmed. You go to a ceasefire first or peace treaty first. You want to make sure that it's lasting, it's sustainable. You ensure the sovereignty of Ukraine, and you ensure that once this thing stops, it never starts again. So the consequences are going to be enormous on either side. So this is the process we're building. I'm going in next week into Ukraine, and we're going to kind of set it up when we come out. When I come out of Ukraine, go into the Oval Office, talk to the president, and say, this is what the alliance says. This is what they see. This is how they see what a sustainable peace looks like. This is what they talk about. When we talk about secure long-term borders, what does it look like? And then you kind of compare it and say, okay, now we've got a kind of framework that we can really work at, that we've never had before. You know, let me just use a couple of data points so you can have them real quickly. You know, President Trump picked up the phone and called President Putin and called President Zelensky back to back. President Biden had to talk to Putin over 2 years. It's kind of hard not to get to a position where you don't talk to anybody. And I think that's an important decision. He's appointed special envoys to do this. So he's taken ownership of this right away. And he's told the American people this is something we're going to solve on good terms, in terms that are good for not just the American people, but for good as well. And I'm trying to abbreviate because I know you want to get to the question as quickly as possible, but know that we're into the game, we're into the game hard, we're going to work on solutions that does not mean anybody's exclusion. And I don't mean when I say anybody's exclusion, that doesn't mean Ukraine, it doesn't mean Russia as well. But it doesn't mean that we're excluding the alliance as well. Because when you come to a final call on this, that everybody is involved, not just, by the way, just not Europe. This is the alliance as well. What do you think? What is your definition? And then you kind of pull it together and you kind of say, okay, this is the collective view. And then I bring it back to the person that does make the decision. And Keith Kellogg doesn't make the decision. It's the President of the United States. And I will never, ever move into his territory of decision making. And we give him advice, he makes the call. President Trump is the decision maker, full stop, period. But we have to give him the option. Good advisors that I found in the first 4 years of the Trump administration, I was there with Kellyanne and Rick was there as well. The fact is, you give them options that are what I call left and right, meaning you give them a full range of options. You never cut off any option. And if you've seen some comments happen even this week, we have said quite clearly every option is on the table. And it's important that those are kept for the President of the United States to make a decision. So I'll close by saying, what does it look like? I don't know, because that depends on what I'm seeing and what I get a feel for. But it's not going to be the exclusion of anybody. We're going to listen. Now, you know, and I do this, and I know the press is back there, and this is a joke, okay? So please don't take it as a joke. But the probability if the Russians say, well, we'll buy into it, but you have to give us back the state of Alaska, that probably is not going to happen, okay? So it's, you know, so there are certain things that say, no, those don't play at all. You're going to give us a bit of a breathing space or time, but when I say that, I'm not talking 6 months or a year. We're talking days and weeks.
Days and weeks. Well, you said you wanted to hear others' perspectives.
As I said, I'm a school of realism. I think that's not going to happen. But I said that's one of the reasons I'm here talking to people. One of the reasons we're going out, we're doing it, to making sure that their positions are well known, that when we go into these positions, they're well stated. Now, that may be great, figures on a chalkboard. That may grade a little bit, but I'm telling you something that's really quite honest. So part of the problem that we looked at when you looked at NICS 2, there was a lot of people at the table that really had no ability to execute some type of peace process, and it failed miserably. So we're not going to go down that path.
Thank you. That's very clear.
Oh, well, you just changed the whole dynamic. President Victor, thanks for having us today. I appreciate it. The answer to that last question, just as you framed it, the answer is no. The answer to the earlier part of that question is yes. Of course the Ukrainians are going to be at the table. I mean, who would be foolish to say they wouldn't? But when you say at the table, you have to define it. One of the things I'm driving towards is we've had a good, remember this war has been going on now, we're heading into the third year. One of the things we haven't really gotten to is specifics. What does it really look like? And we talk a lot about it, and I will criticize, and I know I'm being very, very political when I say this. President Trump inherited this war right now, but our philosophy is not to continue this war to the death of every last Ukrainian. The intent is to stop the carnage, stop the war, make sure it's reasonable, making sure the sovereignty stays intact. But we're going to get to specifics about it. When you say sitting at the table, in all probability, there's really going to be, one of the reasons I'm here is for the input, obviously. But when you sit at the table, there's two protagonists when you look at it, and there's one hopefully being intermediary.
Okay, who's the protagonist and who's the intermediary?
Well, I'm saying notice I'm being very diplomatic about it. I got my diplomatic hat, my passport in my pocket. The fact is, we're looking at, you can have the Ukrainians, the Russians, and clearly the Americans at the table talking, but we've got to have specifics to get to a point. President Trump has been very, very clear. He said this on the very first time he went to the United Nations and the UN General Assembly, and he talked about, if you go back and you look at his talk, he talked about the importance of national sovereignty. Look at his speech. And he said, if you fight for your sovereignty, we will be with you. He has said that, and he's never abandoned that. So what we've got to figure out is what does this look like? And that's what we're in the process. It's been so easy to sit there and make it a cottage industry of talking about solutions. But we want to have a stable environment, we want to have secure borders, we want to whatever it's going to be. But I'm driving towards very, very specific, very, very hard data that we can say this is what it looks like. And then it's going to be up to the two belligerents that are fighting each other right now, the Ukrainians and the Russians. Is this acceptable? But there's no way, nobody would ever exclude, and nobody's even said that. I would challenge anybody in this room, or anybody in the audience, to say, when have we ever said that the Ukrainians would be excluded from any discussion? It's never been said. President Trump's been very open about that. Two calls made immediately, one to Putin, one to Zelensky. Talking with Vice President yesterday. My going into Ukraine this week. When you look at what happened in the last 2 years, I'm going to be very, very critical now of the United States. President Biden had not talked to Putin in 2 years. Rick described it as 3 years. Okay, the fact is you can't do that. The fact is you have to have people talking, whether you like it or not. I remember I worked for a guy named Secretary of Defense Mattis at one time, and he said about an adversary, I really hate the son of a bitch, but I got to talk to him, okay? And it's kind of the same way. So we're going to get to a position where we can come out of this and ensure the sovereignty, the security of Ukraine, and actually achieve goals that we're not going to see a Minsk 1. We're not going to see a Minsk 2. You're not going to get there. This is going to be a stable, long-term environment that we don't want to be started again. Now, and I'll close with saying this, but here's what you need to understand and really take it. A ceasefire or long-term peace agreement isn't going to be the real determinant of success. The real determinant of success will be the first time a ceasefire is broken. Then how do the national leaders of all these countries respond? Do you respond by saying, that happens? As President Biden said on television, a national audience, a quote, minimal intervention by the Russians in Ukraine may be okay. He said that. His definition of minimal incursion for the Russians is significantly different than my minimal incursion.